Good afternoon, everybody. We are assembled here once more to celebrate the 75th independence of India, 75 years. And we are celebrating we are remembering the scientific heroes of those era. It's the pre-independence era. And this is, I think, the sixth installment of the series of talk. And we are pretty fortunate that we have our previous director, Professor Sibaji Raha, who will be talking on the life and work of Sir Professor J.C. Bose. I request our director, Professor Jagadis, to kindly introduce the speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this series of talks of this illustrious scientist in the pre-independence era. And as Rajiv has mentioned, India is celebrating the 75th year of independence. It's a one-year-long celebration. It's the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. It's named like that. And the theme of this celebration was the contribution of the scientist in freedom struggle. Of course, the scientist sometimes can directly also contribute in freedom struggle. Sometimes the contribution can be even indirect. They glorify the country which is under the, basically is ruled by some foreign country. And in terms of glorifying one country's name, I think the scientist can contribute in the biggest possible. So keeping that theme, taking really the essence of the theme, not really the literally word by word of that theme, what we have decided that we will organize this series on illustrious scientists in the pre-independence era. And as has been also mentioned by Rajiv, there have been 5 talks on that. We first started with none other than Chandra Bose, this institute being in the name Chandra Bose. The second one was on Acharya Chandra Ray. The third one was on Meghnad Shava, and that talk was in Bengali because we thought that we reached to many people. The fourth one was Viva Chaudhary. The fifth one being on C.V. Raman, and of course, this galaxy of scientists, probably one of the very prominent names is Sir J.C. Bose. And today we are going to have the talk on Sir J.C. Bose. And we are very fortunate. I don't think there can be any other speaker who can be, more appropriate to give this talk, because he has been associated with Bose Institute for a long time, served as the director of the Bose Institute, and as mentioned by Professor Mitra, he was also the officiating director of Esengo Center. So he knows our place very well. By profession, his scientific inclination is a high energy physicist, astroparticle physicist, and he has a very big passion for history of science. So that's even more, it's a very appropriate speaker to give this talk. And he has, I don't know how many of you know, maybe many of you know, he has very strong German connection in terms of this synchrotron thing. And we are very fortunate to have him here today. And, I think many of the people I see, they know him and they are greeting him. It's like a homecoming. And he is going to talk about Jagadis Chandra Bose, not only his work, but also on his life, and probably more importantly on his times. So I'm sure everybody is eagerly looking forward. Professor Raha, may I now request you to.
Okay, it's a real pleasure to be back here, and I thank Mr. Shahadas Gupta and Rajiv Mitra for inviting me to give this talk. And we'll be talking about J.C. Bose, but more than J.C. Bose or his contributions, about his contributions to the ethos of Indian science. Begin from the beginning, because by all reckoning, he was the first experimental scientist to adopt what we call today the Western means of pursuing science, Western attitude towards science. And nowadays, especially given the present scenario, there are talks about whether India's tradition precedes all scientific practices everywhere in the world or not. Let me not get into that argument, except to say that there are probably two distinguishing features between what we call Eastern science and what we call Western or modern science. And the distinguishing aspect of Western science is through designed experiments. You come up with a theory, a proposition, but that, by definition of modern science, it has to be falsifiable. If the principle, the theory, is not falsifiable, if one cannot provide an avenue through which one can test it, then it is not rigorous science. And J.C. Bose probably was the very first scientist in the Indian subcontinent to adopt that philosophy. So that's why he is called the doyen of modern science in India. His life is very illuminating. So I'll just go through a very brief sketch of his early life. His father was born in a middle class Bengali family. His father was a deputy magistrate, born in now Rarikal, which is now in East Bengal, Bangladesh. But the distinguishing characteristic which J.C. Bose experienced during his early childhood was that he was initially educated in a vernacular village school, and he was taken care of by an ex-convict. His father was a deputy magistrate, so he was in charge of the local discipline and law and order. And there was a convict, ex-convict, whom he tried to rehabilitate, and he left Jagadish Bose in his charge. So he would take Jagadish Bose to his school, teach him all kinds of village games, teach him how to swim, and introduce him essentially to nature. And it was this lesson which remained with J.C. Bose and modeled his approach to science to a large extent. I'll come to that in a few minutes. He moved to Kolkata in born in 1858, just a year after the Sepoy Mutiny. He moved to Kolkata in 1870s and entered St. Xavier's College in 1870 and got his BA degree from this college. And it is in this college that he met a Belgian Jesuit teacher, Father Lafont, who used to teach the physical sciences. And it was Father Lafont who introduced J.C. Bose to demonstrations in physics lectures. So in his college, rather than giving rules of physics, okay, and write them out on the blackboard, he used to demonstrate principles through examples and hands-on examples, which was J.C. Bose's motto all his teaching life. He married in 1887, Lady Owola, who in her own right was a very accomplished and dedicated person. She was the moving force behind Brahma Balika Vidyalaya of Kolkata, which many of you know. After his bachelor's, as was the wont in those days, even though Bhagwan Chandra Das's father wasn't really very affluent, and he had also passed away, leaving a large amount of debt to J.C. Bose. J.C. Bose went to England to study medicine, but the rigors of study of medicine didn't suit him, primarily because during his early youth, he had contracted Kalajar during his trips to Assam. And in the cold weather of England, that cleared up. And his mentors suggested that you won't be able to withstand the rigor of medical education. So why don't you shift to natural sciences? So he shifted to Christ's College in Cambridge. And in Christ's College, he studied physics, botany, and chemistry. So he got his tripos in 1884. And his later directions in studies and research were essentially modeled by the people he met there. This is a picture of Sidney Vines, a very well-known professor of botany at Christ's College. This is Lord Rayleigh, whose name needs no introduction in this audience at least. And he also had Francis Darwin. It is the son of Charles Darwin. Then others are Francis Balfour, Professor Hughes, and Michael Foster. So now a bit of history. This talk will actually go back and forth between his life and the times. This is 1864, when J.C. Bose was not in the realm of higher studies yet. But in the period, this period is actually very important because James Clerk Maxwell read a memoir before the Royal Society. And this is when he introduced his now famous set of equations, and that's where he introduced the scalar and the vector potentials, and in fact, even the Coulomb gates, they were all in there. But in 1864, while people knew the laws as such, of Coulomb's law and others, there was no way the beauty of this compact description appealed to the people. Almost everybody found this to be an extremely abstract and forbiddingly difficult description. So they said, okay, it's good for mathematical compactness, but what is it good for otherwise? And 1879, Maxwell died. His theory remains unconfirmed. Experiments were not done, at least not in earnest. And people tried to construct mathematical models, hoping to rid the formulation of its troublesome abstractness. Maxwell, Thomson, Kirchhoff, Lee, Fitzgerald, Helmholtz, and others toiled at it, but not too much success. The first breakthrough comes in 1883, and that is precisely when J.C. Bose was just about to complete his tripos. Incidentally, he also got a bachelor's BA in physics from the University of London the same year, 1884, together with the tripos. Fitzgerald made a bold suggestion in the Royal Dublin Society. He said that if we discharge a Leyden jar into a loop of wear, that could generate a high frequency oscillating current. And that is something which is provided for or accounted for in the set of Maxwell's equation as they stood then. So 1886 to 1888, Heinrich Hartz, the German physicist, he takes this suggestion seriously, and he discharges the output of a spark gap generator via a Ruhmkorff coil into a dipole antenna, and observes how each spark sets off an accompanying spark across the air gap between two open ends. And this is his detector. And this, notice, is also transmission of signal without the aid of the wear, because this detector loop is kept at some distance away. Okay? So this would essentially mean that such a disturbance created was propagated across the air gap, and so that must have been done to some kind of a wave which propagated through the air. And that showed the existence of the Hertzian wave, or the wave which is predicted by the Maxwell's equation to occur. And in Hertz's experiment, the wavelength of the wave was 66 centimeters, so about a meter. And they showed that they travel with the speed of light. And he also could show them that this was diffracted using a slit, and showed that they were linearly polarized. And from 1888 to 1894, a number of investigators the whole world over, starting with Lodge, Righi, Popov, Fleming, and others, they repeated Hertz's work and tried to take it forward. And one of the primary ingredients in that was the choice of the suitable detector. Now, Maxwell's equations tells us that if this is a Hertzian wave, it will have an electrical and a magnetic component with it. And the magnetic component could be detected if I have a mass of iron filings. When the magnetic field acts on it, the iron filings will get ordered. The disadvantage, of course, as you can readily see, is that every time the magnetic wave passes, you would have to reset the detector before it can be used again. Now, 1894, Hertz died. He couldn't establish it, propagate his work beyond what had already been achieved in 1889. That is, with wavelengths of 66 centimeters. And then in 1894, J.C. Bose starts experimental research work in Kolkata. J.C. Bose returned to Kolkata, Calcutta after his tripos. After a bit of uncertainty, he finally managed to get a job, a teaching job as professor of physics at Presidency College. And there is an anecdote associated with that, which I can mention in a minute, which will somehow justify putting this talk in the Platinum Jubilee celebration of India's independence and the independence struggle. But I'll come to that in a minute. He had been working at Presidency College. For the first 10 years, there is actually no evidence of him being involved in any active research from 1884-85 till 1894. In 1894, the year that Hertz died, the year he became 36 years of age. On his birthday, 30th November, J.C. Bose made an entry in his diary that I don't want to waste my time without doing something substantial and contribute to the glory of the motherland. And I have decided that by pursuing the development of science in its purest form, I would contribute to, I would provide service to the motherland. As if that for these previous 10 years, he wasn't really doing any science. He was only teaching. This actually is some kind of an oversimplification. And I can remind you of a quote from Dick Feynman. Dick Feynman wrote once, I think it's the introduction to his book called Theory of Fundamental Processes, where he says that when you try to solve a problem, you really have to go through trial and error. You make all kinds of mistakes. You make repeat mistake after mistake until after a lot of work you find the answer. And then you just write down the steps and let others marvel at your genius. The hard work you never report. Here also, it's my firm belief that this is also something like an over-dramatization there. He must have been preparing himself for this research by keeping himself abreast of the development in the whole world through his contacts with the Cambridge group, and knew exactly what was happening, and he was most likely trying out various variations in private. But be that as it may, everybody who's achieved success is entitled to get that kind of publicity later on. So he says that he wanted to show that the analogy between electric radiation and light, which is the basic tenet of Maxwell's electromagnetic theory, it could be rendered more complete if the class of substances which polarize light were also found to polarize the electric ray by refrigerants. Right? Now, the hindrance was that if you have a 66 centimeter long wave, to reflect it, to refract it, to polarize it, you really need crystals and mirrors the size of this room. Because otherwise there would be such huge distortion that you wouldn't be able to conclude anything. And this is where the marvelous thing that J.C. Bose did. He succeeded in reducing the wavelength to about 5 millimeters, which we call microwaves today. And he performed his experiments with moderate size, manageable crystals. And the interesting thing is that this was done at a time when the idea of waveguides was totally non-existent. And there are details of his experiments which I don't really want to dwell too much on. These are part of the slides, so if anybody is interested, they can find it fun. What was interesting is that he found a new detector, the so-called spiral spring coherer, which holds sets of springs held together side by side under pressure that can be varied. And so the detection takes place at the many points of contact between the coils of the spring. This is a diagram of this detector. And he also showed that there are various kinds of polarizations which polarize both electromagnetic, both light and electromagnetic fields. For example, one of this is a cut-off metal plate grating, and this is a consisting of a book, the Bradshaw's Railway Timetable, and interleaved with foils of tin. So with this, he could use as a polarizer. And George Barnard Shaw humorously said that, well, J.C. Bose is probably the only person who can shine light through the Bradshaw. Otherwise, nobody knows how to read it. Twisted jute polarizers. Notice that all of these ingredients, all of these parts of the apparatus, were made from indigenous ingredients and made in-house. And that has actually been J.C. Bose's hallmark all through. He got all these equipments designed and manufactured by the local artisans in Rajabajar. Okay, so 1894-95, at Presidency College, in the office of his colleague P.C. Ray, J.C. Bose conducts an experiment. He generates this electric ray, and he shows that these rays travel through air, wood, stone walls, and human body up to distances of 75 feet. Okay. And this is a picture of his demonstration at the Royal Institution in 1897. This is a full picture. And this was hailed as one of the greatest breakthroughs of physical sciences at that time. On the strength of this, J.C. Bose got a master's degree and a DSc from the University of London in 1896. Lord Kelvin, Lord Rayleigh, all of them were there at the Royal Institution, and they congratulated J.C. Bose because this was effectively first demonstration of propagation of signals without any wires. And the other thing that needs to be pointed out at this point of time is that, well, this is the waveguide that I was referring to. This is a crystal, okay? This is essentially a biprism with which he could later on demonstrate something like total internal reflection and effectively hint of quantum tunneling way before, long before the concept came into being. But what is necessary to note here is that this is the kind of a design which is called the horn antenna, collecting the scattered waves, okay, and leading them to the detector. This horn antenna is an interesting invention which finds use even today in millimeter wave astronomy. Those of you who are familiar with the Kitt Peak Observatory in Arizona would know that the horn antenna is still the basis of their detection platform. Okay, so this was the first time the birefrigerants showed conclusively that the Hertzian wave is essentially the electromagnetic wave. This was proved conclusively. And with this, the hope of complete analogy between electricity, magnetism, and light became established. The full details of this work will take all the time that I have, so let me not get into a detailed discussion of that. There are several articles available, so if any of you are interested, please feel free to look up the, ask me for the reference that we have provided for you. Okay. What did J.C. Bose's discovery or invention what kind of message did it impart to the general populace? Firstly, as I already mentioned to you, that this was one of the problems of extremely high currency. The almost whole world, all the physicists in the world were working on this problem at the time. So this was a great success. And J.C. Bose was hailed as the bright shining light of science internationally at that time. His teachers in Cambridge, they all patted him in the back and said that, well, see what kind of a good student we have produced. Shortly afterwards, there was an international conference, the Congress of Religion and Science in Paris, 2000. And Swami Vivekananda was present when J.C. Bose was giving a lecture. So this is just a eulogy. Vivekananda wrote in his in one of his reports that today is the 23rd of October. Tomorrow evening I'm to take leave of Paris. This year Paris is the center of the civilized world, etc., etc. From among that wide galaxy of geniuses, there stepped forth one distinguished youthful hero to proclaim the name of our mother, Bengal. It was the world-renowned scientist, Dr. J.C. Bose. Along the youthful Bengali physicist with galvanic quickness, charmed the Western audience today with his splendid genius. With electric charge infused pulsations of new life into the absent body of the mother. At the top of all the physicists today is Jagadis Chandra Bose, an Indian, a Bengali. Well done here.
Which year it was?
2000. 2000.
Vivekananda's writing.
Yeah.
1897. 1897, right?
No. 1897 was the year when J.C. Bose demonstrated his experiment to the Royal Institute.
This is 1900, maybe?
Yeah, 19. I'm sorry.
No, we were very confused. 1900.
19. Sorry. Vivekananda died in 1902. Thank you.
Vivekananda's 5 years junior to J.C. Bose.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, this is a picture of Margaret Noble, Sister Nivedita, who came to Kolkata first as Vivekananda's disciple, but she and Vivekananda's other disciple, Sarah Chapman Gould, they visited J.C. Bose in Presidency College, 1898. And Sister Nivedita, even before she became Sister Nivedita, she was still Miss Margaret Noble. She had tremendous interest in the tradition of Indian scientists and Indian science and architecture. She kept on insisting that the resurrection of any subjugated nation must find its expression through heritage and through sound standing. So she felt that J.C. Bose and this modern scientific tradition that he was introducing would be the right path of emancipation for India. And she struck a lifelong friendship with Lady Avala and Jessie Bose. In fact, many of, after Vivekananda's death, the intimacy grew even more, and most of Jessie Bose's writings were edited by Sister Nivedita. Okay. Now, there is a bit of digression that I must get into here. That is, in 1897 or beginning 1894, when Jessie Bose started demonstrating this transmission of signals without wear, and in 1897 we demonstrated it in London, there was another competitor, or competitor is not the right word, but there was another scientist who was single-heartedly working on the problems of transmission of signals, and that was Guillermo Marconi. Marconi was in the audience in London when Jessie Bose gave his lecture. And Jessie Bose wrote to Rabindranath in a letter that there was tremendous melee after my talk. There were several people who wanted to take out patents for this, but I did not want to agree to that. And in that melee, somehow my handwritten notes disappeared. Somebody pinched them. And what happened was that in 2 years' time, Marconi repeated his experiment and achieved success by using the detector which was fashioned after the phone antenna that I showed you. And when people asked Marconi that how did you come to the design of this horn antenna, he said that Righi had suggested it. Righi, when he was asked, denied. So this controversy was never really settled. Marconi got the Nobel Prize. Jessie Bose was not mentioned in any of these inventions. When somebody asked Jessie Bose whether he felt cheated by not having got the Nobel Prize for his discovery, Jessie Bose's answer was that doesn't matter who gets the credit for it as long as the work gets done. But I think Sister Nivedita, Sarah Chapman Bull, and Vivekananda felt piqued at this. So they insisted that Jessie Bose file a patent. And he filed a patent in 1899, the first US patent from Asia. And it said, detector for electrical disturbances. And this had one ingredient which is very significant, and that is the detector material in this was lead sulfide or galena. And Jessie Bose did its characteristic, analyzed its characteristic, and published included them in his writings. And this was essentially the very first example of a semiconductor. Anyway, this patent was granted in 2004, but Jessie Bose never renewed it. And historically, the person who paid for this filing fee was Sarah Chapman Bull. And Jessie Bose wrote a check to Sarah Chapman Bull for the filing fee of £80. which Sarah Chapman will endorse to Lady Obola, and this was never encashed. We found this check in J.C. Bose's archives, so this is now stored in our museum. One interesting coincidence here, I really ought to mention, that J.C. Bose's birthday, 30th November, is celebrated as the foundation day of Bose Institute because he also founded the Bose Institute on his birthday, his 59th birthday. In the year 2006 or 2007, when we were celebrating the foundation day of Bose Institute, on which day the institute has an open house and visitors are welcome to visit the archival museum. Somebody came and told me that there is a foreigner who's visiting the museum, spending a lot of time there, and then he has written something in the visitors book. I was busy with the speaker of the foundation day that day, so I did not have a chance to go and read him or find out who he was. So later on, when I looked at this visitor's book, I saw that the visitor had written that having been to this museum, I realized that Sir J.C. Bose did the experiments leading to wireless transmission of signals 2 years before my grandfather, and signed Francesco Parese Marconi. This is something which is a really great entry in our visitors book. And as a matter of fact, he was invited as the foundation day speaker 3 years later. And he came and naturally the journalists would have a field day, so they kept asking him that, did your grandfather steal J.C. Bose's work? And then he essentially dodged. This gentleman himself is a very well-established electrical engineer, electronics and electrical engineer who worked at the European Southern Observatory. He said that I will repeat what J.C. Bose said. As long as the work gets done, that's the triumph of science. And besides, Marconi was never a scientist. He was an engineer. Okay, that's what it was. Okay. So we are talking about, I already mentioned the involvement of J.C. Bose and Lady Obola with Sister Nivedita. The Rabindranath's assessment was that during this time, J.C. Bose's work and his contributions were greatly aided by Sister Nivedita. Come back to the chronology. 1894 to 1899, production of the shortest possible electromagnetic waves of 5 millimeter and verification of their quasi-optical properties. And this is where the change in his life's mission occurs. Between 1899 and 1902, he used the detectors that he had already developed, filed the patent for, and he just used them to find that there are some similarities of responses in the living and the non-living. Namely, what he found was that the same kind of response you can find both in inanimate objects as well as in living tissues. And from 1902 to 1933, the rest of his working life, he essentially passed over to the study of responsive phenomena in plants. Complexity of whose responses is the intermediate between inorganic matter and the animals, of course. So the majority of his life, research life, was devoted to studying the response phenomena in biological systems, namely plants. This is a picture of J.C. Bose, drawn by Jagadis Thakur. And this is essentially motivated by the famous painting called The Revealer, where Newton was depicted. He was depicting the nature of light through the prism. So Jagadis picked up the same theme and wrote about, drew J.C. Bose. So 1902 to 1933, J.C. Bose devotes most of his time and energy in studying the biophysical aspects of the living and plant systems. And his views ran contrary to the beliefs of the times, indeed even those prevalent until very recently. So he wrote, somewhat poetically, that these trees have a life like our own, they eat and grow, face poverty, sorrows and suffering. Poverty may induce them to steal and rob, they may also help each other, develop friendships, etc., etc. Okay, so Rabindranath described him as a poet in the world of facts, and in fact, this is a really curious fact that of all the male acquaintances that Rabindranath Tagore had during his life, he had the habit of writing poetry dedicating to them, poetry or novels dedicating to them. He wrote the largest number of poems dedicated to J.C. Bose, 7. And then he described J.C. Bose as a poet in the world of facts. So this is a collection of many of these equipments that J.C. Bose designed and developed in order to measure the response of the living systems to various kinds of stimuli. And it's still a marvel that the accuracy of many of these systems continue unsurpassed even today. By using a lamp and scale, he could achieve magnification of 10,000 times, which is surprising. Many of the responses that he obtained were at the level of single cell responses, namely depending on the probe. He could design probes which could access single cells and measure their responses. It was very difficult for other people to appreciate him, and that's precisely why his competitors often labeled him as a charlatan, saying that these are wrong. And of course, his interpretation did not appeal to people, so they kept saying that this is not genuine science, this is Eastern mumbo jumbo and all that. The interesting thing is that all this criticism motivated J.C. Bose to essentially develop more and more sophisticated equipments with which to measure these responses. So his answer to criticism was through providing better and better data, which I think is probably the philosophy every scientist needs to adopt and practice. It's almost like the cricketers who say that we answer through our bat. Similarly, for an experimental physicist, it is important to show that, vindicate the data at the best. There are certain myths which persist in the name of J.C. Bose. For example, his great achievement in using the semiconductor device led Sir Neville Mott to say that J.C. Bose was certainly ahead 50 or 60 years ahead of his times. Because he anticipated through the characterization of the lead sulfide, he anticipated the existence of N-type and P-type semiconductors. These are essentially J.C. Bose and Nivedita's interaction. I'll come to that if I have time. Nivedita, as I mentioned, was extremely interested in the heritage of India, and she led several expeditions together with Nandalal and Suren Kaur and others from Shantiniketan. And she made several sketches of Indian heritage architecture, Ajanta and others. And all of these were incorporated in the design of the Bose Institute when it was ready. The Nivedita's sketches were the inspiration for Nandalal and Suren Kaur. This is something which also has a very great historical significance. This is Nivedita's sketch of the Vajra under. And she mentioned that this is the emblem of supreme sacrifice. So this became the emblem of Bose Institute when. Okay, I'll just take another 5 or 6 minutes to mention the relevance of J.C. Bose today. Before getting into that, let me also mention that we had already quoted Sir Neville and his appreciation of J.C. Bose's work on semiconductor physics. Einstein once was asked about J.C. Bose's work, and he said that if monuments were to be erected for scientific discoveries, there should be 6 monuments in J.C. Bose's name. And the other interesting fact is something that took place in 2008 on the 150th birth anniversary of J.C. Bose, and Christ College, Cambridge, where J.C. Bose was an undergraduate, approached us for a bust of J.C. Bose to be erected in their grounds. The only two other busts there include Lord Milton and Charles Darwin. Okay. So we were delighted to provide a bust, which is now adorning the grounds of Christ College. But on that occasion, they organized a one-day international symposium entitled "A Journey from Physics to Biology," to sum up J.C. Bose's life's contribution. And Sir Neville's quotation was repeated there, and they said that if his electromagnetic research was 60 years ahead of their times, his plant biological research was a century ahead of his times. Because many of the measurements that he had predicted are now being repeated, and there is actually a very vibrant field called consciousness in plant sciences. Now, one of the interesting things that came out of that symposium, I was fortunate to be able to attend that, was that people said that J.C. Bose shifted from physics to biology, which is not at all true. He used the biological system and made physical measurements. So it's not that he gave up physics and started doing biology. So he was, in every sense of the word, father of the discipline electrophysiology or biophysics as such. Anyway, to sum up, I think there is no doubt that J.C. Bose was a towering figure in science whose appreciation during his lifetime may have been limited, but it's growing. What is the legacy that he left to this nation? What is legacy? Legacy is inheritance, heritage, tradition, or something received. And this legacy can stem from achievements, contributions, personality, character, spirit, disposition, or message. J.C. Bose's personality can be summed up by saying that scientist of rare talent, had a philosophic vision, literary imagination, he was a naturalist seer, reasoned emotion, passionate nationalist, humane, usual traits that we list when we want to deify somebody. Let's not take them too seriously. But the primary legacy that J.C. Bose stood up for is domination over adversity, scientific originality, discovering truth, and aesthetics as the foundation of creativity, and faith in India's traditional future. Many of these beliefs were embodied in the inauguration lecture that he gave at the date of the foundation of Bose Institute, 30th November 1917. And this lecture is available under the title of The Voice of Life. And it is my strong recommendation to all of you, everybody who can read English should read this at least once. The transliteration of this also exists in Bengali, which is included in its collection of Bengali writings. That transliteration is called Niveda. Many of the things that he said there continue to be extremely relevant even today. Once again, by reading through all of them will take enormous time. So let me not do that. But I'll just go to one of the most simple, most relevant ones, where he said that nothing is impossible if we put our whole mind to it and pursue it with unwavering determination. Distrust acts as a blight. It is by optimism that we radiate hope and strength. Pessimism and cynicism are not only vulgar, but a sign of decadence. He gave several lectures on the difficulties of research in India. In 1911, the one lecture that he gave at Mymensingh is particularly important, where he said that it is true that we suffer from many difficulties, but how does it help us to envy the good fortune of others? Rise from your depression, cast off your weakness, and let us think. We often forget that the real laboratory is one's own mind. The room and the instruments are only externalized. Every experiment is first to be carried out in the inner region. To keep the mental vision clear, great struggles have to be had. his adherence or his advocacy of India's tradition for scientific inquiry is something which is worth emulating. Where he said that in this country through millennia, there has always been some who beyond the immediate and absorbing prize of the hour sought for the realization of the highest ideal of life, not through passive renunciation, but through active struggle. We can, however, claim with full justification the existence of ancient school pursuing exact experimental methods in their investigations. There can be no doubt that they had a clear conception of various bodily functions, often in advance of contemporary knowledge. The marvelous technique, the elaborated mystiques, their patient pursuit of the experimental method. This is one quotation which reminds me time and again how prophetic his vision was. 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, he wrote that India is drawn into the vortex of international competition. She has to become efficient in every way, through spread of education, through performance of civic duties and responsibilities, through activities both industrial and commercial. Neglect of these essentials of national duty will imperil her very existence. Reads as if it was just written in the present background. And in a speech to the students of Presidency College, he said that our motto should be that we sow, though we may not reap the fruit. And this is the concluding sentence of his inaugural address at the foundation of Bose Institute. He said, we stop here today and begin our work tomorrow, so that through our united efforts, we can bring about the greater India yet to be. That greater India yet to be is yet to be. So his exhortations remain valid, and especially on this occasion of the Platinum Jubilee of our independence, we really need to remind ourselves of lessons that he brought. Before I complete, I would just mention one anecdote which I had promised at the very beginning. Why does he qualify to be called, to be recalled in the context of the India's freedom fight? Somebody once said that J.C. Bose could be called the very first non-violent rebel of India, the non-violent freedom fighter, before the word term non-violence was introduced by Gandhi. When J.C. Bose was appointed a professor of physics at Presidency College, this was done in the face of severe opposition. The person who was the DPI at that time was essentially forced into appointing J.C. Bose by the Postmaster General, whom J.C. Bose met in England. And he came with a very strong recommendation from him. So the DPI resisted that. He did not want to appoint him. But he was essentially overruled. So finally he pulled a dirty trick. He said that even though there are two kinds of services at that. One was the so-called imperial service, and the other was provincial service. P.C. Ray, even though he had a PhD from Durham, from Edinburgh, he still served his life in the provincial services. J.C. Bose was given a temporary appointment in the provincial services, even though most of the people appointed as professors at that time were inferior to him in terms of qualifications and experience. So J.C. Bose's salary was 1/3 that of a full professor. J.C. Bose did not accept that salary. He refused the salary. But for 3 years, he carried the full workload. He taught his classes. Because of financial difficulties at the time, he couldn't maintain a house in Kolkata. He lived in Chandra and he would sail across the river and come to Residency College to teach. After 3 years, the government finally relented and paid him back the entire arrear salary, which J.C. Bose used to pay off his father's debt. Large part. But anyway, for 3 years, this was a non-violent, non-cooperation, but fulfilling all his required duties. So in that sense, he was the first non-violent freedom fighter. He sought freedom from the discrimination of subjugated nations, as a subject of a subjugated nation. So that probably qualifies him for as a freedom fighter, but anything more appropriately, I think the lesson that he imparted to all of us is that one has to fight and overcome adversities through one's own efforts. It does not, that is one of the quotations there was, that it does not help to complain about the adversities and give up. One really has to fight and overcome them the best of it. And that is not only in terms of science, but in every walk of life. If the declared intention of the present Amrit Mahotsav is to prepare the country for the centenary of our independence to come in 25 years, I believe that is precisely what we strive for. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Raha, for this very illuminating excellent talk. So maybe we can take some questions. Questions from people. Yeah.
So when this institute was built, was it named like Oshu Vigyan Mandir?
Officially, it was never called Bose Vigyan Mandir. It was always called Bose Institute, and in some area, some records, it was called Bose Research Institute. But the registered name was always Bose Institute. The origin of the name Bose Vigyan Mandir it really stems from his inaugural talk. His introduction to the inaugural talk was that today I dedicate this institute not merely a laboratory but a temple. In Bengali, when he translated it, he said that Dev Charane ei Vigyan Mandir Nivedon Koriya.
So I have a question that I've been curious about for a long time. Did anyone, either at the Bose Institute or elsewhere, carry on with the research that J.C. Bose did on the response of plants?
Yeah. In fact, there was a small group of people who pursued electrophysiology after J.C. Bose's death, you see, historically speaking, electrophysiology was thought to be the way signals are transmitted. Primarily because at that time the ionic transport was not possible. J.C. Bose's ingenuity notwithstanding, I think his scientific approach was very straightforward. See, he lived during a time when quantum mechanics was being born. Never cared to learn it. So, for him, the only means through which signals could be transduced were electric waves and nothing else. So, electrophysiology, in the sense of devoid of all chemical pathways, was something which was not. Today, one understands that electrophysiology and chemical reaction mechanisms must go hand in hand. So, J.C. Bose's research was supplanted by D.M. Bose, his successor, to a certain extent that he wanted to find the proton chemistry behind the signals and essentially understand the biochemical means of the observations that J.C. Bose had. And today, one realizes that even though electrophysiology is something, the interpretation that J.C. Bose had made may have changed drastically. The observations that he had made are being vindicated. They are being certainly appreciated.
During his 3 years of protest in the Presidency College, J.C. Bose was able to continue his research, right? J.C. Bose could continue his research also during his 3 years of protest. He did not take the salary.
During the, well, actually, according to him, during that time he wasn't interested in research.
Oh,
He started research only in 1894.
okay, okay. So at what time, Bhagavad Nivedita and Rabindranath Tagore, they were trying to generate some funds so that J.C. Bose could continue his research?
Yeah, this was during the time 1898, 2000, 1900, 1902.
Okay.
Because he first, once again, since you asked the history, he went to demonstrate his experiments in 1896. 1894, 95, he demonstrated them in Kolkata, first in his college, and then at the town hall. Then he got the permission from, once again, he wrote to Lord Kelvin, who invited him to come and demonstrate these experiments. So on his strong recommendation, the government of Bengal education system, DPI, permitted him to go. So they gave him study leave with salary. And having demonstrated those experiments, Kelvin and Rutherford, not Rutherford, but Rayleigh, perhaps also Rutherford, they insisted that you stay back in Cambridge, we give you access to our laboratory, and complete the work. At first, the government, the DPI had asked him to come back. He wrote again saying that with enclosing those recommendations from the stalwarts, and at that time they gave him leave without pay. That's when Rabindranath got into the came and he started raising, he attempted to raise money from Maharaja of Tripura.
Okay, thank you so much for giving a lot of information about Prof. Bose. I have a question that whenever we see, like last time we had a talk about the Nobel laureate here, and there were a lot many discussions about his students, and there was a lot of discussion about his successor in the scientific way. So, what was it all about, Professor Bose?
He never really started a school. His attitude was that, in fact, if you go through his publications, you'll see that J.C. Bose and students, J.C. Bose and associates. He never trained anybody into a PhD. So effectively, for him, this was, and see the kind of attitude that prompted him to found an institute and name it after himself. So for him, it was all the trainees were there just to help him. So he never wanted to build anybody up to be his successor. And there is actually a story which you may appreciate. That is, you asked who his students were. Well, S.N. Bose, Meghnad Saha, P.C. Mahalan, Nagesh, D.M. Bose, all of them were his students in Presidency College. Now, he started Bose Institute and naturally he was the director. Around mid-20s, 1920s, there are certain records which have not been publicized much. They have been hidden. That maybe he had some kind of a sickness, felt a little weak. So he asked Meghnad Saha whether he would take over the institute after this he was stepped down. Meghnad Saha apparently told him that I don't do the kind of things that you do. And J.C. Bose's answer to that was that it doesn't matter as long as it's good science. And then the story was that he had to propose it to the governing body. And awaiting the nod of the governing body, J.C. Bose went on a trip to Europe and he bought a spectrophotometer for Meghnad Saha's use. However, the governing body did not agree to appoint Meghnad Saha in Bose because of his. And as a result, J.C. Bose did not nominate anybody as a successor. When J.C. Bose died, it was primarily Rabindranath who paved the way for D.M. Bose to be successful. Of course, there is no question asked about his credentials. He will be one of the best living scientists, and probably, other than Raman, he was the most effective experimental physicist with the broad outlook. It just goes to show that Meghnad Saha was thought of very highly. He was denied the opportunity primarily because of his past.
Because of his caste, not his political views.
In those days, Meghnad Saha wasn't politically very. This was 1920s. his first political stand was from the river project. That's when his political awareness and his stand and anti-establishment attitude came forward. Prior to that, he never spoke about anything other than science and the science.
Story goes like that. Bahajuddin actually asked Meghnad Shah to stay away from taking up arms. He said that you guys are brilliant. Not everybody has to serve the country by taking up arms.
Okay, so any more questions from students? Yes, someone from the online. So we thank Professor Raha for the excellent talk of this session. Thank you very much.